So good evening to everyone and welcome. The second in our series of forums. The first one was back in July, and it was on environmental justice. It was called Environmental Justice Unwrapped. And that's exactly what we did. We tried to talk about the what, the why, the implications, and some effective strategies that work in terms of guaranteeing that Black and brown peoples and poor communities are not suffering from greater exposure to environmental burdens or hazards than other communities. So that we think was a very fruitful discussion. This is the second in our series tonight. The title is An Unholy Link Between COVID-19 and Environmental Justice Communities. Current research that's coming out of, now am I, yes, I'm on, okay. That's coming out of Harvard and a number of other places for that matter is showing that there is a definite link between COVID-19 and the, a lot of the deaths because of the pollution that's in environmental justice communities. So tonight we're going to be trying to explore what those links are between COVID-19 and air pollution. The focus is on human health and the link between human health and the environment. It's on how air polluting industries impact that health from the womb through old age. We're going to talk about the disparities in exposure to air pollution, who breathes in more dirty air around the world, how pollution and COVID-19 are linked, and the role of the EPA and clean air regulations in this unholy kind of bond and the regulatory trends that we witnessed today. So just some housekeeping rules. Just as I muted everybody, we're going to ask you to please stay muted until we get to the Q&A. There is a chat room, so if you have questions that come up as we go along, you can put your questions in the chat room. There should be a hand raise function, and if you don't see a hand raise function available to you, you can use that clap function that's available. And we will have a question and answer period. We're going to try to allow at least a half hour for Q&A towards the end. So if everybody sticks to that, we will be fine. And so we're going to begin by hearing from Beth Gardiner, a nationally known environmental journalist. Gloria Boyce-Charles, our co-host, will also right now give you more details about Beth, and I will share the screen because Beth, since she is in London, we had to tape this remotely. So Gloria.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Good. Good evening, everyone. Blessings to all. I'm Gloria Boyce-Charles, Vice Chair of the Eastern Queens Alliance. And so this evening, we're joined by 5 champions of environmental activism. We're going to hear from each one of them in their area of specialty. And then, as Barbara said, we're going to open the floor up for a dynamic question and answer period. We're going to allow people to engage with our speakers, our panelists. So we're looking forward to that. So for that reason, everybody presenting, our panelists are going to be 10 to 12 minutes in their presentation, and that will allow for more Q&A time. So we're going to begin with Beth Gardiner. She is an environmental journalist who has written for such publications as the New York Times, The Guardian, National Geographic, and the Smithsonian. She is the author of Choked, The Age of Air Pollution and the Fight for a Cleaner Future. Sorry about that. I don't know how to get rid of that. Beth is based in London and agreed to pre-record her comments, which you will hear at the outset, with some additional comments at the end of our other presentations. Now, before we go into Q&A, you'll be hearing her additional comments. Now, when Barbara and I met with Beth earlier this week, we asked her to talk about the harms posed by polluted air and how these harms shed light on the environmental disparities in the environmental justice communities, especially during the COVID pandemic that we're all living through right now. So let's hear now from Beth Gardiner. I know Barbara's going to be setting that up. It's the first time we've done that, so bear with us if there's just a little, glitchy stuff going on here.
Okay, so let's see how good I am here.
All right.
Okay, so the first topic was concerned air pollution, and a lot of your research and findings on air pollution. I know in your book Choked, you start by even talking about how we draw a breath and how breathing is the essence of life. And then you had there was a quote in one of your writings saying that cleaner air would help to flatten the curve of the pandemic, reducing the number of patients requiring hospitalization at any one time. And so tougher regulation that brings cleaner air would not only improve health generally, but also function as a form of pandemic readiness by making people more resilient when future outbreaks hit. The coronavirus has just made invisible visible and given an additional argument to act on air pollution, and that kind of resonated, that the coronavirus is making things that were seemingly invisible to a lot of folk now visible. So what do you mean by dirty air or polluted air, and why is it so problematic to us as humans? What's the link? What do you see as the link between COVID-19 and dirty air? And how would cleaner air help us to flatten that curve?
Sure. So, I mean, the reason really why I set out to write my book, Choked, to write a book about air pollution, was because through some of my other reporting for newspaper and online articles, I had, spent a little bit of time reading some of the science of air pollution and how profoundly it affects our health. And it really shocked me when I read some of that, because as I'm sure you know, the scientific research on air pollution and health is overwhelmingly powerful. And there were two things I learned, and this is sort of going back eight or 10 years before I began researching the book. Two things that I learned about that really shocked me. Two sides of the same coin, I guess. One was just the absolute power of pollution's impact on health. And what you start to see a lot of when you research in this area is these numbers, estimates of how many people die every year prematurely from the effects of breathing dirty air. So, globally, the World Health Organization puts that at 7 million every year, people dying before their time from this invisible thing, the air that we're breathing, dirtier than it ought to be. In the US, it's upwards of 100,000. That's like 3 times as many Americans as die from gun violence every year. Now, I would not for a second want to minimize the importance of gun violence as an issue, but it's certainly something we talk a lot about and that we debate and hear about. Whereas air quality killing 3 times as many Americans, is really almost barely discussed. So that shocked me, the power of pollution's impact on our health. And the other thing that really sort of made my jaw drop was the variety of ways that it affects us. So I don't think anyone would be surprised to know that air pollution is exacerbating asthma, it's causing, other kinds of breathing problems, even lung cancer. That's pretty intuitive. It's all true. But I don't think it would really shock anyone. But what I did find shocking was all the other things air pollution is causing. So there's now a tremendously powerful body of scientific evidence linking dirty air to increased rates of heart attacks, of strokes, of many different kinds of cancer, of dementia and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and premature birth and low birth weight and birth defects, and now even diabetes and obesity, things that sort of, as a layperson, you wouldn't even imagine would be connected to pollution. So when I started to learn all that was when I'm a journalist, an environmental journalist, and I just really thought, as a person, as an individual, I worry because I live in a polluted place. But as a journalist, I felt like, why is this not getting covered more? This is such an important story. It's impacting people so profoundly and so invisibly. So that was kind of what I set out to do with the book, to really shine a light on that through telling some of the stories of the science of how we understand it, and the people who live with it, and the people who fight against it, and the politicians who do or don't regulate it. And then the next thing I think you asked was about COVID-19.
Yeah.
So, we're now, 4, 5, 6 months into this pandemic, and we're already starting to see some very, very powerful studies demonstrating clearly, you can see in the data that places that have higher levels of pollution are experiencing higher levels of higher incidence of COVID and higher death rates from COVID. So I think those studies are really important. We need to have that evidence. But to me, and I'm no scientist, I'm just a journalist, but to every air pollution scientist I've spoken to as well, this was absolutely obvious from the start. It's the logical conclusion of everything we know about air pollution and everything we know about COVID. So everything I just told you is that places that have higher levels of pollution are going to have elevated numbers of people, with disproportionate numbers of people with heart disease, with breathing and lung problems, with cancer, with strokes, with diabetes, with all these illnesses that we now know put us at much higher risk. These pre-existing conditions put you at much greater risk if you should get COVID, of having a severe experience of it or of dying from it. Mm-hmm. So, that's one thing. More people with pre-existing conditions because of air pollution means greater risk from COVID. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that breathing all this pollution every day leads us to have, first of all, it weakens our immune systems. That's another thing that the science has found. So you want your immune system to be operating at 100%, obviously, when you encounter a virus like this. It won't be if you're breathing a lot of pollution. And the other thing is that all this pollution we take in creates inflammation in our lungs and our airways. And that is a dangerous situation to be in when you're encountering a respiratory virus like COVID. So that's the sort of biological situation that we're in. And then you obviously also layer on top of it and this is maybe something we're going to get to in subsequent questions, you layer on top of that the socioeconomic and sort of societal issues, and the systemic, historical, and ongoing racism and environmental racism that mean that the places with higher levels of pollution very, very often, disproportionately often, as you well know, are places that are home to people of color, communities of color, to poorer communities. So these communities are not only, breathing higher levels of pollution, which will make them more vulnerable to COVID, but also, as we now all very well understand, are much more likely to be populated by people who are in frontline jobs, who are, for economic and work reasons, unable to sort of shelter in place when there's a stay-at-home order. So, all these things are kind of brewing into this really toxic mix that is bringing these two dangers, air pollution and COVID, together. And what we're seeing is that they're really magnifying each other.
Yeah, and a lot of what you said really resonates with us. First of all, a lot of people don't realize that they are breathing in polluted air because you don't smell anything special for the most part. So the assumption is it's air. Right. It's the air that we have to breathe. The other thing that very often we hear, particularly for the environmental justice communities, is that, well, the people there, the Black and brown peoples, are, it almost, they make it sound like all those conditions that you mentioned, heart disease and diabetes and blah, blah, high blood pressure, are something that's inherent, that's inborn.
Right.
And that's why those people get sick, as opposed to maybe they develop these conditions because of the polluted air, because of other facts, maybe some other factors, but it has nothing to do with because I'm Black, I have some affinity for some of these conditions. So what do you see as some of the implications for health outcomes in future pandemics, given all of this, if nothing changes?
Right. So, I've been talking to a lot of scientists, air pollution scientists, since the pandemic began. One thing I heard that really, resonated for me was an Italian scientist I spoke to who's been studying air pollution for many years and who said, when you have spent your career studying air pollution and you're used to the death numbers attached to that, I told you 7 million annual deaths globally, 100,000 in the US, you almost feel like the COVID numbers are, they're much lower. They're less shocking when you're used to seeing 7 million dying every year. Globally now, what are we at? 800,000 deaths, I think, from COVID. Obviously that's not a useful way to really to look at it. And this is a terrible pandemic that is, devastating so many people's health and lives. But it just sort of shows you the scale, actually, of what air pollution is doing on its own. So that was one thing that really caught my ear when the scientist said, compared to what we're sort of not even aware of, the deaths happening from air pollution every year, COVID, it's much less than that numerically. And then the other thing that was really interesting was an activist I spoke to who said that, we know that there's more pandemics probably coming down the road towards us. And based on what we know about COVID and on what air pollution is, doing to our health. So obviously air pollution, separate from any pandemic or any virus, it's devastating many people's health on its own. But when you live in a polluted place and you're breathing this polluted air, you are much more vulnerable to a pandemic. So I spoke to this one guy who said, it's like preparedness for the next pandemic. Let's make our populations healthier. And one huge way to do that is, by cleaning the air. And, we saw at the beginning of this pandemic that the Trump administration the EPA actually suspended pretty much all enforcement and reporting of air pollution regulations for the duration of the pandemic. And they said it's necessary for economic reasons. We can't put this terrible burden on these industries that they need to be reporting their emissions. Well, what we've actually seen from that is more pollution, more facilities putting out more pollution. It's actually the direct opposite of what you would want during a pandemic, because the other idea that we talked about is, flattening the curve, which has become a very familiar notion to people in viral terms. But if you're concerned about overwhelming your health system in a pandemic, one thing you can really do is reduce pollution, whether that's, in some places there's a lot of pollution from wood burning in rural areas. People are like burning logs. You can, for heat or for fire in their home, you can put more regulations on that. you could tighten rules actually rather than loosening them on industrial sources of pollution or ships or trucks or planes or what have you. And you talked about this sort of blame the victim language that gets used oftentimes around communities of color, as if pre-existing conditions are people's own fault rather than result of the circumstances that they're living in, oftentimes because of racism and economic inequality. But I think one thing that's really important to understand here when you're talking about air pollution and you hear that kind of language is that this is really at bottom about power and money. And there are, we see on the one hand the impact in communities all across the country and all around the world, but what we see less of is actually sort of the cause and the sources and the behind the scenes, lobbying and campaign finance and all of that from these tremendously wealthy, tremendously powerful industries. All of these industries, they have a very, very strong incentive and they have a lot of politicians, doing their bidding in their pocket for, reasons to do with the corruption of our political system that, we all are very familiar with now. And they would much rather, those politicians and those industries, put the blame on communities, on people who are breathing the air that is present and is surrounding them in their community. They would rather put the blame there than put it on, huge multinational corporations that are actually profiting from putting out all this pollution.
Thank you, and that leads us into our next section. So that takes us back to Miss Gloria. That was the first part of what we taped with Beth Gardiner. We have a second piece which will come after everybody else has spoken and just before our Q&A. So Gloria.
Okay, great. Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Neelakshi Hudda. Dr. Hudda is an environmental engineer and a research assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Tufts, where she researches the effects of transportation emissions on air quality and human health. Now, Dr. Hudda has studied and modeled highway emissions, their impacts on air quality in surrounding communities, and their effects on health in human participants, in animals, and cells. Dr. Hudda's research has led her to focus on the impacts of airport-generated air pollution and to suggest some ways that we can mitigate some of those harms. So here now is Dr. Neelakshi Hudda.
Oh, thank you for unmuting me.
Okay.
I'll start over. So good evening, everybody. Thank you, Gloria and Barbara, for providing this opportunity to me to connect with a wide audience and talk about my work. My charge, as laid out, was to present information on the impacts of aviation emissions on air quality that are under-recognized, but they do significantly deteriorate air quality in near airport neighborhoods. So I've summarized a few key points, if I can figure out how to, yes. So I've summarized a few key points that I'd be making tonight. The first one is, as I've mentioned earlier, that the adverse impacts of aviation emissions on air quality in neighboring communities remain under-recognized. And I will show you data on what we mean by that. The second is that near airport communities rank adversely on environmental justice metrics, and it should come as no surprise to this audience. Thirdly, as Beth also talked about, many of the adverse health conditions that are underlying risk factors for worse COVID-19 outcomes, they are prevalent at a much higher incident rate in near airport communities. Fourth, COVID-19, an unfortunate pandemic, but it was also what we researchers called a natural experiment, which helped us quantify what the impacts are of aviation and transportation-related emissions on air quality. And I'll show you some data from those experiments. And lastly, I want to talk about use of filtration as an effective mitigation strategy to reduce our exposures to some of the air pollutants. So expanding a little on the first point, the adverse impacts of aviation emissions on air quality remain under-recognized, and there are at least three aspects in which they are under-recognized. First, unlike noise, air pollution exposure is often not a palpable experience. Noise is a nuisance that we have a visceral reaction to. We hear it, we react to it, we want to do something about it. Air pollution exposure often is not that case. Sometimes if you do live particularly close to a runway and a plane is taking off and a lot of rubber is burning in the process, you can smell it, but air pollution exposure is not that sensory an experience. So the communities experiencing these exposures, they are not fully cognizant of the harm that's occurring in breathing the air that is enriched with air pollution. Second, and this is where I as a researcher play a role, is that community level exposures to elevated levels of air pollution from aircrafts or near airports have been understudied and essentially unstudied, I'd say, in certain respects. A lot of research has focused on emissions out of aircraft engines directly, right at the tarmac to understand some of the engine emission profile. But impact doesn't begin and end at the tarmac or the runway. It stretches out into the communities living downwind of airports. And third aspect in which it is somewhat under-recognized, and it's perhaps a consequence of the first two, is that the regulatory framework of mitigation measures don't quite recognize air pollution mitigation to the same extent as noise. Now, I wanted to expound a little bit on the first point there. Our work has recently shown that the adverse impacts of aviation emissions on certain air pollutants can extend as far as 10 miles from the airport. So on the right side of the screen, you'd see a graph of data collected via what we call mobile monitoring, in which we have a lot of instruments in a car and we go around on roadways making measurements of the air. You'd see a graph that shows air pollution pattern downwind of LAX, which is a large international airport. The pollutant that's plotted here is called ultrafine particles. These are particles that are really small, about smaller than 100 nanometers. So we're talking about something that's smaller than the size of a human blood cell. Because they're so small, they're particularly good at penetrating deeper into the lungs and also capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier directly. They have been linked a lot to what is called systemic inflammation, so an exposure to them basically raises your baseline inflammation in the body. The pattern here, I hope, is somewhat evident, wherein you'd see that there are higher concentrations, those would be the richer hues, under the flight paths, which are shown by the arriving planes, and also by the 65 decibel noise contours from LAX. And it was under the areas that were most directly under the flight paths that we saw the highest concentrations. Now, I do want to make the point that at LAX, we found the impact to stretch 10 miles, and in Boston, we found the impact to stretch around 4.5 to 6 miles. but all airports are not the same. These depend on the capacity of the airport, along with other factors such as meteorology. So at a smaller airport, perhaps the impact zone is not going to extend as far as it does at LAX. Now, the near airport communities also rank high on what are environmental justice metrics, which is kind of a misnomer. They should be called injustice metrics, as I'll show later on. But here's a map of around 700 airports in the 48 states of US. The population that lives within, let's say, 3 miles of an airport, of all these airports, is around 34 million. So that's about 10% of US population that lives within 3 miles of a US airport. Now, if I look specifically at some of the larger airports that have more than 3 million enplanements, that number is 6.2 million. If I look at just the top 23 or airports which have greater than 10 million enplanements, people getting off on the flights annually, that's about 3.2 million. But these are the largest of airports and therefore will have large impact areas. So if I look at what is the population that lives within 10 miles of the largest of airports, which are shown here in red, that's around 33.3. So about 10% of US population lives within 10 miles of a major airport, wherein you can expect deterioration in air quality due to airport-related emissions. I want to spend a few minutes looking at what the demographic factor, what the demographics of that population look like. So this data was drawn from EPA Environmental Justice Screen, EPA EJ Screen. If you Google that, it should take you to a website which I urge you to explore and look at your own neighborhood and places near and farther away from your neighborhoods as well. The graph here shows what the distribution of minority population is in the census blocks that are within 10 miles of the top 23 airports. So the way percentile ranking works, you should have a very even distribution, give or take, depending on a little bit of nuance on how things are classified. So if you look at the gray bars, they're pretty evenly spread across all rankings. But if you look at the red bars, which are within 10 miles of top 23 airports, you'll see a skew. There's a higher presence of higher minority population, fraction of the total population that is minority, considered minority in those block groups. If you look at what fraction of the population is low income, we don't see much of a skew there compared to what we see in terms of the racial profile. Now I want to show you some of the environmental indicators that are considered in environmental justice metrics. And the same story here, wherein you'd see the gray bars are pretty evenly distributed, but the red bars, which are within 10 miles of top 23 airports, they have a skew. There's a higher presence of higher concentration of diesel PM, elevated cancer risk, higher respiratory hazard index, and also there's a greater proximity to traffic and higher traffic volume. So these are communities that are exposed to higher metrics of environmental indicators. Third point that I wanted to make was that many of the adverse health conditions that are somewhat related to an adverse outcome for COVID-19 are also prevalent at higher rates in near airport communities. And these include, there's pretty good evidence for hypertension, rates of hypertensive medication prescription, cardiovascular disease incident, cardiovascular disease related hospitalization, some evidence regarding adverse learning outcomes in children, and lately preterm birth. Now, COVID-19 was also what we call a natural experiment, which we use to quantify what the contribution of transportation-related emissions are on air quality. So the economic disruption pretty much lowered transportation activity across the board, from cars on the highways to airplanes. So during the lockdown period, when the economic activity and transportation activity was way down, we went out and conducted measurements on highways. And we found at least in a city which ranks 94th percentile in terms of traffic proximity. So that's pretty high. Yeah, and it's exposed to a lot of traffic emissions. In that city, Somerville, Massachusetts, we found that the air was around 10 times cleaner. We had 10 times lower concentrations. It was as clean as laboratory air, which was unprecedented, at least in my research. And we also made some measurements in Chelsea, which was a community that was pretty much the epicenter of COVID-19 crisis in Boston area. And it's impacted by all sorts of transportation emissions, including emissions from the airport, Logan International in Boston. We conducted these measurements during the lockdown period, and we compared the data to what we were measuring during lockdown versus before the lockdown, when everything was normal. And the graph on the right tells you the story, wherein the data in the blue is what we were measuring during normal concentrations, and the data in yellow, the shrunk rows, is what we were measuring during lockdown. This format of data presentation is called a rows. On the right bottom, you'd see a kind of a hook extending towards what is southeast. That is pointing towards the airport. Airport is the major source of emissions at this location. So the highest concentrations are measured when the wind is from the direction of the airport, southeast. Next slide, I want to talk briefly about use of filtration as an effective mitigation strategy. So filters are designed to clean the indoor air, and they do their job, which is by design, they filter the particles out. This study was not focused, the data I'm showing here was not focused on aviation, but these were filtration intervention trials where we were trying to figure out if filters are an effective way of lowering indoor concentrations. And we found that they do lower your concentrations, do lower indoor concentrations significantly if you were operating them for long enough. The key point to take here is that the gray bar on the left graph, but the rightmost gray bar, it's lower than the other two gray bars that are circled by red circles. So concentrations were lower when we were using a standalone HEPA filter in people's homes compared to the outdoor concentrations. Concentrations were also lower when we were using what we call in the trial as a sham filter, which didn't really have a filter inside it, but it was just a machine that was running. We found significant reductions in concentrations. And the graph on the right is from a research trial that we just concluded, in which people sat in what is called an exposure chamber. Other than the fact that it wasn't really an exposure chamber, this was a real life experiment. So it was a room next to a highway, wherein we exposed people to what we call low, medium, and high levels of exposure. So 3 different levels of exposure. Low exposure, we used a lot of filters in the room. We really cleaned up the air. Medium exposure, we used a little bit of filtration, and we didn't really seal up the room real tight. And in the high exposure, we did not use any kind of filtration. We did not seal any of the doors or windows, so they were cracked open. So the point of this trial was to show if filtration helps reduce your blood pressure, increase in blood pressure, or limits your increase in blood pressure, even if you were to lower your concentrations for a short duration. So this is a 90-minute duration study. We found that people who were same people, when they were exposed to lower levels of air pollution, had a lower increase in their blood pressure over that duration. Each participant was serving as their own control in this randomized control trial. But other than filtration, we should also be promoting good and informed ventilation practices. Filtration works, but if we have to open our windows, knowing what the best time of the day is to open the windows, which way the wind is blowing, what time is, what direction is the airport. If the wind is blowing in the reverse direction, then that's a good time to open your windows and freshen up the air inside the home. And here I want to summarize, here on this slide, I've summarized the key points that I've made, which I guess I won't have to repeat, but Gloria, would you like me to summarize them again?
Yes, I think that would be helpful.
Good.
Yeah, sorry, high level, summary would be good.
Right.
Thank you.
So in summary, the adverse impacts of aviation emissions on air quality in neighborhoods around airports clearly remain under-recognized in many ways. These are communities that already rank adversely on environmental justice metrics, and airports are an environmental insult on top of that. Many of the adverse health conditions that are underlying risk factors for worse COVID-19 outcomes are already prevalent at higher incident rates in near airport communities and have been linked to aviation-related exposures. Now, COVID-19 also offered us an opportunity to quantify what the contributions are from aviation or transport-related emissions to these communities. And not that we didn't know it, but now we can put a number on it, and it's huge. Lastly, to end on a positive note, use of filtration, which could be standalone HEPA filters that could range somewhere from less than $100 to whole house or mechanical ventilation, which is a rather expensive investment, is an effective mitigation strategy. But I would stress the point again that just owning a filter is not enough. You have to run it, and you have to keep it running as often as you possibly can for those to be effective. It's all about air turnover. The more you run it, the more it turns over the air, the cleaner it becomes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Hudda. I appreciate, and I'm sure we all appreciate that overview. Very enlightening. I hope everybody's writing their questions down, because we do want to give everyone an opportunity to engage with the panelists at the end of these presentations. So write your questions down. Our next panelist is Dr. Leo Trasande. Dr. Trasande is an internationally renowned leader in environmental health. His research focuses on the impacts of chemicals on hormones in our bodies. He has also led the way in documenting the economic costs for policymakers of failing to proactively prevent diseases of environmental origin. Now, Dr. Trasande is the Jim G. Hendrick, MD, professor, director of the Division of Environmental Pediatrics, and vice chair for research in the Department of Pediatrics at NYU School of Medicine. And he also serves on the faculty of the NYU Wagner School of Public Service and the NYU College of Global Public Health. Tonight, he will address the topic of environmental impacts on health from womb to the emerging adulthood. Dr. Trasande?
Thanks for having me. I will focus my comments tonight not on air pollution. I think that's been really covered quite nicely by the previous participants, but on a group of emerging contaminants that are in everyday products. Everything from furniture, electronics, personal care products that literally hack our hormones and thereby contribute to disease and disability. And unfortunately, these same chemicals represent a disproportionate exposure in communities of color and low-income populations. Let me just provide a quick summary of what we know about this category of chemicals. We know, so hormones for a moment just to explain, are signaling molecules that underlie everything from maintaining a normal temperature, good metabolism, salt, sugar, even sex. And those are natural molecules. What we're talking about here are synthetic chemicals that either mimic directly the hormones and thereby have their effects that way, or they act through a variety of other mechanisms to influence hormonal function, perhaps even by changing the expression of genes that are crucial for metabolism, as we'll talk about. There are about 1,000 or so synthetic chemicals we know about at this point that hack our hormones and thereby contribute to disease and disability. And the evidence is strongest in particular for 5 categories of chemicals. The flame retardants used in electronics and furniture, pesticides used in agriculture, bisphenols used in thermal paper receipts and aluminum can linings, phthalates used in personal care products, cosmetics, and food packaging, and perfluoroalkyl substances that are used in non-stick materials, as well as some oil and water resistant clothing. Now, you may be asking yourself, why didn't I hear about these chemicals before? And the fact is that the science has rapidly evolved over the past 2 decades. The first real scientific report that put this issue on the map was from the Endocrine Society in 2009. Its first scientific statement from a society of 17,000 scientists, clinicians, and others really put this issue on the map. Then in 2012, the World Health Organization and United Nations Environment Program really brought this issue to the fore. And then in 2015, the Endocrine Society put forward the second scientific statement, just 6 years after the first. That's because they found 1,331 scientific references documenting serious concerns about this category of chemicals. So the evidence has really rapidly escalated. So what do these chemicals do? They really cause a variety of effects from cradle to grave. Early in life, what we know with most certainty is that the brominated flame retardants and the pesticides mess with thyroid hormone during pregnancy. Now, we think about a child getting the heel stick done for a newborn blood spot to make sure their thyroid hormone is functioning, because you could treat that and replace the thyroid hormone with medication and prevent the child from having permanent and lifelong intellectual disability or brain damage as a result. But what we also know is that during pregnancy, the baby relies on mom's production of thyroid hormone. And even in the so-called clinically normal range, where you might draw mom's blood test for thyroid hormone and everything might look fine, even subtle shifts within that normal range are associated with cognitive deficits, autism, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And these chemicals, brominated flame retardants and pesticides in particular, reduce the function of thyroid hormone functionally, and thereby set a child up for not being as well able to perform in school and being less well able to perform in the economy. Moving along the life course, we have a lot of evidence now suggesting that chemicals are obesogens. At least 50 or so chemicals do that. So the prototype is bisphenol A or BPA. You've probably heard about BPA-free baby bottles. That was a big push back in 2012 when the FDA banned BPA from baby bottles and sippy cups. BPA makes fat cells bigger, disrupts the function of a protein that protects the heart, and it's a synthetic estrogen, so it can have sex-specific effects on body mass. The plasticizing chemicals, phthalates, actually affect the way genes are expressed that are crucial for lipid and carbohydrate metabolism. So imagine you're having a healthy, protein-rich meal. You're thinking it's going to go into muscle mass. And unfortunately, what these chemicals do is scramble those signals and essentially shift the calories to lipid and carbohydrate, making one literally fatter. The perfluoroalkyl substances that are in non-stick cooking and other materials, they actually have been found in a study of adults who successfully lost weight through healthy diet and physical activity. They found that the ones with the higher levels of these PFAS, what they call forever chemicals. There's a movie, Dark Waters, recently out that talks about it, that it slowed those adults' metabolism such that they gained more weight. So imagine a cold winter day. It's hard to imagine that on a 90-degree day like today in New York City, but imagine if the thermostat's turned the wrong way and you're actually cooling rather than heating your bodies in that house. That's what basically these chemicals do. And so they preserve energy and thereby allow for greater deposition of that energy in fat. So in addition, we know that these chemicals contribute to diabetes. And that's important here when we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, because these synthetic chemicals that we're talking about contribute to obesity as well as diabetes. And insofar as they do that, they set people up for greater risk for having COVID-19 related mortality. It's not to say that studies have yet identified these chemicals the same way as they have with air pollution, because you have to draw blood levels of these chemicals or measure them in urine, as opposed to modeling air pollution levels across the United States that others have done earlier. But we also know that these chemicals can hack hormones and hack the immune system. And hacking the immune system is plausible because the hormones in our body play a key role in shaping how our body responds to infection. So we know, for example, that the perfluoroalkyl substances reduce immune responses to vaccines. They lead in children to greater difficulties with various infections, ranging from colds to stomach bugs to ear infections. The bisphenols actually increase the production of inflammatory, what we call cytokines, proteins that ramp up the body's immune response. And IL-6 is one of the cytokines that bisphenols tend to ramp up. And actually one of the treatments for SARS-CoV-2 infection, tocilizumab, is actually an antibody to IL-6, speaking to how, in fact, what's happening is these chemicals are increasing a cytokine storm that ultimately we try to treat as doctors to prevent people from succumbing to the disease. The same thing is true, unfortunately, for the phthalates, the plasticizing chemicals. They also disrupt cytokine secretion through a variety of pathways. So that all is rather shocking and disappointing. And scary. And the reality is, we know from national surveys that Latina and African American populations, as well as low-income communities, suffer disproportionate exposures to these chemicals. And insofar as their levels of chemicals are higher, their disease burden due to these chemicals are higher, and the cost, the burden they bear as a result of these exposures is even greater. And we've demonstrated that in a national study that we conducted a couple of years ago. But there's hope, and I'm going to leave you with some safe and simple steps we can all take to limit these exposures. And obviously there's a lot of need for national as well as state and local action to prevent these chemical exposures. But just to give you the quick summary, avoiding canned food is the best way to reduce your exposure to bisphenols. And insofar as you're getting that thermal paper receipt at a coffee shop these days, it might be best to say no instead, because that bisphenol lining on the thermal paper receipt rubs into your hands and absorbs into your body through your skin. In addition, avoiding microwaving plastic or machine dishwashing plastic is a straightforward way to avoid inadvertently contaminating your food and your body with these plasticizing chemicals. Eating organic is a straightforward way also to reduce your pesticide exposure. 5-10 years ago, I probably wouldn't advise that at Bellevue Hospital where I work, the flagship for the New York City public hospital system, because of the cost associated with that, but we've seen so much explosion in the market share that we actually see the big box stores putting organic agriculture side by side with the conventional variety, thereby making it more affordable for families to access that. And just to say one last thing about the flame retardant chemicals, using a wet mop to clean up persistent organic pollutant dust, or essentially opening the window and recirculating the air is a straightforward way to clear some of these persistent organic pollutants. Yes, insofar as the outdoor air is polluted, you are bringing some short-term increase in that exposure, but the benefits of getting rid of some of these persistent organic pollutants could tend to outweigh that potential short-term increase. So with that, there is a lot of hope. There are a lot of safe and simple steps that neither need to break the bank nor require a PhD in chemistry to reduce these exposures. But this is a real issue that unfortunately affects those who shouldn't bear the greatest burden. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trasande. That was very enlightening. I really appreciated that overview, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions to engage with when we open up the floor. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Kimberly Terrell. Dr. Terrell is the Director of Community Outreach at the Tulane University Environmental Law Clinic. She holds a PhD in conservation biology from the University of New Orleans and a dual bachelor's in biology and in political science from Tulane University. Now, throughout her experience as a scientist, Dr. Terrell has always felt strongly connected to the culture and environment of the Gulf Coast. With her knowledge of environmental issues and experience working with diverse communities, Dr. Terrell helps concerned citizens engage in environmental decision-making and access the legal resources of the Environmental Law Clinic. Dr. Terrell is here to talk about the experiences and the challenges of the people in Cancer Alley, Louisiana, as they fight COVID-19 and chronic illness in the face of air pollution. Dr. Terrell?
Thank you so much, Gloria. I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to share my screen so I can show you all some images from Louisiana. And there's a Nerf war going on outside my window, so I hope that doesn't interfere. So what you're looking at here is an image of St. James Parish, which is at the heart of a region known as Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And this parish, just the 5th district of this parish, which is the most predominantly African-American section of the parish, is home to 9 major petrochemical plants, one of which recently got approved for a massive expansion. And in addition to that, there's 2 major new plants that are under construction, as well as an additional 4 plants that have been permitted. So we're talking about 15 major petrochemical facilities in an area that's about the size of Queens. And so the folks here are heavily impacted by air pollution, which is also the case in other communities in Cancer Alley. And so as a scientist, it's kind of nuts to me that there's even a debate that this place exists, that Cancer Alley exists. And what we hear time and again from industry is that, oh, well, you know, you haven't proven that people are dying from cancer, right? So it's premised on this idea that people need to get sick and die before action can be taken. And that just goes against every tenet of justice. So if you look at a map of cancer risk from industrial pollution, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has an incredible tool called EJ Screen. And I encourage everybody to go on it. Just Google EJ screen if you haven't explored this resource. And so if we look at the cancer risk from air pollution in Louisiana, it's pretty clear that there's a place called Cancer Alley that deserves its name, right? So the parishes, so in Louisiana, we have parishes instead of counties. And the parishes that are outlined in purple are kind of the core of what's traditionally known as Cancer Alley. And it extends from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. And more recently, this map has kind of extended all the way to the Gulf. So we've seen increased industrialization both within these parishes and in New Orleans and the parishes of St. Bernard and Plaquemine. What you'll also notice is that there's this area in Southwest Louisiana that I'll talk more about in just a moment that's also heavily impacted by pollution. And so it's more than just cancer, right? Everybody in this Zoom meeting is impacted by pollution in some way, right? And we know that the effects of pollution go well beyond cancer. And so again, kind of getting back to this idea of risk, you know, we don't need to wait for people to get sick and die to do something about this issue. We know for a fact that these communities are at greater risk of health problems from air pollution. And so I like to make the analogy of drunk driving. I don't know if the Zoom is blocking this, but you know, if you get pulled over and you're intoxicated, it doesn't matter whether you actually hurt anybody, right? You put people at risk. And in the same way, these chemical plants, these airports, these other sources of pollution are putting communities at risk, and they're disproportionately putting Black and brown communities at risk. So I also want to make the point that, you know, we think of air pollution as this problem that catches up with you later in life. But what COVID-19 has shown us is that it can also bring more immediate threats. So this is a probably overly complex map from a recent study that I co-authored in partnership with a researcher at the University of Memphis. And basically the purple illustrates respiratory hazard from air pollution in Louisiana. And the orange circles illustrate death rates from COVID-19. And so the bigger circles illustrate higher death rates per capita, right? Normalized to population size. And so it's pretty clear that the area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans that we call Cancer Alley is overburdened with air pollution, and it's overburdened with COVID-19 deaths. At one point, St. John the Baptist Parish, which is about in the middle of Cancer Alley, was reported to have the highest death rate in the United States from COVID-19. That parish also has the highest cancer risk from industrial pollution in the United States. And so again, I want to kind of bring your attention to this area in the southwestern corner of Louisiana, because it really often gets overlooked because it's not considered part of Cancer Alley, but in fact, it's what I would imagine would happen if Cancer Alley continued to industrialize totally unchecked. So this is an image from the historic African-American community of Mossville, which was founded by an emancipated, formerly enslaved person, you know, and has people who have lived here for generations since then. This is what is left of that area. And there was a really compelling documentary that was recently put out, and this image is from that, and it's called Mossville, When Great Trees Fall. And you'll see a house at the very forefront of this image. That's the residence of Stacy Ryan, who was, you know, one community member trying to preserve his home and preserve his community in the face of this massive industrial development. So, you know, these are the issues that we kind of know and expect, and you know, this pollution is legal, right? It shouldn't be, but it is. This is what's permitted. But then we also have these unexpected issues. So just last night, or early this morning at about 1 o'clock in the morning, Hurricane Laura made landfall in this area. And you can imagine the problems of putting major polluting petrochemical plants in an area that is hurricane prone and flood prone. And so as we speak, there's a major chemical fire happening in Westlake, which is adjacent to Mossville. And this is all in the Lake Charles area. So the residents here were told to shelter in place. Stay inside, close your doors, turn off your window air conditioning units, sit inside in August in South Louisiana, and stay where you are. So it's absolutely, you know, on multiple levels, a major health issue. And we know, again, you know, even when companies are following their permits, people are impacted. So this is Eve Butler, who's one of our clients at the Environmental Law Clinic. She's a grandmother, she's a mother, she's a Navy veteran, and multiple times she's experienced chemical burns on her skin from going out in the rain. She doesn't leave the house anymore when it's raining. Similarly, this is Pastor Joseph. He's another one of our clients. Behind him is a tank farm where liquid oil is stored. And part of the challenge in this community, this is St. James community, is that the parish council has not been protective of African-American communities the same way that they're protective of white communities. So for example, the parish council has drawn buffers around the Catholic churches in the parish, but not the Baptist churches, including Pastor Joseph's church. So companies are allowed to, you know, build and industrialize in close proximity to these churches and these schools that are in the African-American portions of the parish. And so even in the midst of COVID-19, these plants have continued to operate because they claim that they're essential services in Louisiana. And this is the Danka plant in neighboring St. John Parish, where this entire facility and all the pollution that it emits is to produce neoprene, which is a substance that's used to make things like beer koozies and wetsuits. And so this facility has claimed that it's, you know, essential during this pandemic. And this is also a good example of the unique challenges that communities face, right? So we often hear, well, if it's really Cancer Alley, why don't we see higher cancer rates, you know, across the board? And you have to keep in mind that everybody is breathing a different, unique mixture of pollution because there's many different types of plants across this landscape emitting many different types of pollutants. So for example, the Danka plant in St. John Parish emits a pollutant called chloroprene. It's the only plant in the United States that emits this pollution. And as a result, there are not good regulations protecting it because it affects a small number of people, but it affects them so profoundly. And again, this parish was reported to have the highest death rate from COVID-19 in the country. But I don't want to end on doom and gloom. I do want to talk about what these communities are doing to fight this just briefly. So for example, these folks are members of a group called the Concerned Citizens of St. John Parish. And the plant that's emitting this substance is called Danka. It's owned by a Japanese company. And these residents went all the way to Japan last year to try to meet with the people who own this plant and to share their story and to get attention on what's going on. So what has been really helpful, I think, in their struggle is outside groups, human rights groups, environmental groups who come in and bring their privilege and bring their resources and help give a platform to folks like Mr. Taylor and Ms. Gerard, who need to tell their story and need action to be taken to protect their communities. Similarly, you know, concerned citizens groups are getting creative in Louisiana, you know, buying billboard space, honing their messaging, and getting really involved in local government decisions. So in St. James Parish, you never have a council meeting that is not attended by concerned residents who are trying to protect their air. These are the most civically engaged folks that I have ever met. And so I want to just kind of try to end on a positive note and say that I think that COVID-19 has helped to shine a light on decades-long struggles that communities in St. James, St. John, Eastern Queens, and elsewhere have been fighting for decades. But now people are finally paying attention because we see this immediate threat from a respiratory virus. So thank you for listening, and thank you for letting me share some Louisiana stories with this New York audience.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I think, thank you, first of all, Dr. Terrell. That was really compelling. And it's so important to see the people behind what we're talking about, right? The human beings and what their challenges are and what they're doing to fight. And so that's a great segue too into our next presenter, Dr. Sacoby Wilson. He's an associate professor with the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, School of Public Health at the University of Maryland in College Park. He has over 15 years of experience as an environmental health scientist in the areas of exposure science, environmental justice, environmental health disparities, community-based participatory research, water quality analysis, and air pollution studies, to name a few. Dr. Wilson is also the director of the Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health Initiative, which is focused on providing technical assistance to communities fighting against environmental injustice and environmental health disparities. Dr. Sacoby will speak with us about the ways that he works with communities to educate and motivate them towards self-advocacy. So I think it kind of logically picks up, Dr. Terrell, from where you left us. So welcome, Dr. Sacoby Wilson.
Thank you. So I want to get started here. Hold on a second. I gotta move this a little bit around. Try to move the screen. Okay, here it is. So thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Really great to follow with Dr. Terrell. Hey, Dr. Terrell. I think it's important for me to start out, talking about where we are today in this country. Another Black man was shot. 2 protesters were murdered. I think in this country, what we're talking about is state-sanctioned violence against people of color. Okay, it is state-sanctioned violence against people of color. I want to put that out there. This EJ movement, I just want to say quickly, you got men during, with Dr. King, this sanitation worker strike, response saying, "I am a man, recognize my humanity." You got Black folks whose humanity is not being recognized, right? From Arbery, Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and I just want to share with y'all, it's traumatic. I'm tired of the trauma. As Charles Barkley said last night, it's exhausting being Black. Just want to put that out there. That's. I think it's important to talk about that. Now, racism is a public health issue, okay? We're not just in a pandemic, we're in a syndemic. What I mean by that? 400 years of toxic hate and racism, toxic plantation capitalism, as Reverend Lawson said at John Lewis's funeral, which toxic pollution, toxic climate, and toxic viruses, okay? So just want to say that. So all the speakers talked about air quality. It's important that we have this discussion about air quality. And I really want to say, you know, when you think about why we are what we are, we're talking about systemic racism. We're talking about how racism is baked in to all our policies, into zoning policies. You can look at New York for our friends from the Alliance. Julie Z's book, Noxious New York. Why does New York look the way it looks? It's not by accident. Look at Baltimore, racism-based zoning. Look at Cancer Island, Louisiana. We're talking about racism, and environmental justice movement is fighting against that racism. Really what we're talking about is environmental slavery. What you heard about from the other panels is environmental slavery. What's happening in Louisiana is environmental slavery. What the speakers have talked about, how communities are used to host these land uses. State-sanctioned violence, permitted pollution. EPA, state agencies are poisoning Black and brown communities. That is state-sanctioned violence. So I just want to put that out there. What can we do about this state-sanctioned violence? What can we do about this environmental slavery? Because environmental justice is too nice a term. Environmental racism is too nice a term. Environmental classism is too nice a term. So a lot of my work, I engage communities in research, right? And so why is that important? I try to do science that's not just discovery science and inquiry science. And this is I'm gonna have some real talk with y'all. There's a lot of science that's being done out there that is guinea pig science, helicopter science, extractive science. It doesn't lead to real change. It's pain pipping science. I do science for the people, science about change, science for action. Why are you doing science if you're not trying to change stuff? And so in this day that now we recognize as racism in this country, this uprising, we need to have science also play a bigger role in actually solving problems instead of just studying problems. And so in my work, it's important that I want to say that I engage communities to do science that's about change. We value community cultural knowledge systems. Community members in frontline, fence line, EJ communities, they are the true subject matter experts. So the research should be driven by them. Anybody can be a scientist. You don't have to be a PhD to be a scientist, okay? And so if you look at this framework, as you move from left to right, trust in these partnerships builds, right? Communication. How can you work with communities? You have to have really great partnerships. What makes great partnerships, great relationships? Think about the things in your relationships that make them great, right? Trust, you got communication, you got transparency, you got a little bit of Aretha Franklin, you got to have respect, right? And so in my work, I think it's important to support community-based participatory research, also known as participatory action research, and also community-driven research. Communities can do their own research, you know, to make sure that the research, the science is focused on solutions and just not just problematizing. We know what the problems are. We know them for 400 years, y'all. We know about structural inequalities. We know regardless if it's a biological disaster, a natural disaster, a technological disaster, who's gonna get hit first and worst. We've known that, okay? This weekend, or this week is the 15th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. We know the lessons from Katrina. We know the lessons from Harvey. But can we learn those lessons? And if not, communities need to be really driving decision-making to make sure that those lessons are learned and communities are not being impacted as they've been. So you know about CBPR is really engaging communities in all stages of the research process, right? From developing the research questions, the study design, data collection, analysis, dissemination, and translation to action. It's just not good enough to do discovery science and create knowledge. And I have colleagues who say, well, it's just, my job is only to create knowledge. That's what you choose to do. As a Black man who's been Black for 45 years, a person who grew up near a highway, grew up near a concrete plant, grew up near a sewage treatment plant, grew up near a landfill, I have no choice but to do science that's about action and change, okay? And so we want to make sure that CBPR is about partnerships, but communities are driving the process, okay? And so we recognize communities' unit of identity. We want to make sure we focus on action, as I've already said. And again, you got to have really good process. You can't have, I have a research question, I want to work in the community. No, you have to make sure that research question matches up with the needs of the community. And you want to make sure you have authentic partnerships, quality processes. One of the really important things about environmental justice, one principle is communities speak with their own voice. So how we bring it into research? So you want to have meaningful involvement when you're doing research for communities. You want to think about transformation. How are you transforming the research? How do we actually lead the community transformation? Capacity building, empowerment. I'm using the word empowerment. I'm not saying E empowerment. I'm saying I empowerment. I've been schooled by community mentors. They say, Sacoby, you can't give me power, but help me connect to the power that I already have. Help me actualize my power. Help me get a seat at the table so I'm actually helping to impact decision making. That's what the word empowerment means. And another thing in science that is really important, we have this, and this gets back to systemic racism. I would say academia is racist, okay? That's to say academia is racist. Everybody can just say, think about, just say racism. Don't be scared to say racism, because racism is why we are where we are. Racism is part of the reason we're having this discussion. And in academia and science, it's also racist. We have people who do research, as I've already said, they talk about discovery science. And for some reason, they think they're being very objective, like Sacoby, my science is objective. All science is biased, okay? It's based on your lens, it's based on your opinions, it's based on your lived experiences. There's nothing wrong with that. But be honest about that. It's about rigor and make sure the rigorous science to actually create data that can create knowledge that can solve problems. So Boyer talks about the 5 dimensions of science: the science of inquiry, the science of integration, the science of teaching, the science of engagement, and science of application. I tell my colleagues and students, if you're not doing all 5 dimensions, you're not your science is incomplete. And that's important when we think about environmental justice, because we know the problems. So teach people, man. Be transdisciplinary in your science. Engage communities in the science and apply it. Be action-oriented. Don't be passive, be active. Your science should be dynamic. Your science should be social. Your science should be about justice. That's important. So when I do work in communities, I think about it's like the 2 hands of engagement. What are the issues? What are the impacts? What are the opportunities? What are the benefits? And what are the partnerships? And any issue you work on, you connect it to food, faith, family, health, and jobs. You have to make science every day. Make it proximal. Environmental justice is about where we live, work, play, pray, and learn. It's proximal. Make it pocketbook. That's how you engage folks in science. And then you have to talk about what's your why and what's their why. And make sure the whys match up and you're doing work that's impactful. And again, it's about change, okay? And a lot of my work is also citizen science. Now, citizen science is a very inclusive term. A better term is community science. But it's really about how can we democratize science? Some old school citizen science, bird watching, right? Water quality monitoring. You got folks doing heat mapping. You got people collecting samples on mosquitoes, folks doing stormwater work. Really about democratizing science. As I said earlier, anybody can be a scientist. And that's true equity. That's true inclusion. And that's true justice when it comes to science. So in my work, we do a lot of using low-cost sensors to measure air pollution. I really appreciate some of the comments of other speakers about permits. EPA is permitting poison. Now let me give you a little bit of problems with the whole EPA system. A lot of the regulatory monitors that are out there to measure particular matter, as was talked about by earlier speakers, those regulatory monitors are not located at where you have hotspots. Those regulatory monitors are not getting data on site-specific communities, site-specific issues. So with environmental health, we call it exposure misclassification. Particular matter could be 20 at the site, could be 10 miles away from the location of the new factory. Particular matter could be 5 micrograms per meter cube below the annual standard or the daily standard. But what is it at that neighborhood? We don't have enough monitor to get the granularity to actually capture true exposure profiles, which means we have bad science in, this is for the community folks, bad science in and bad policy out. Our regulatory monitoring footprint does not represent our industrial footprint. So it's really not matching the needs of frontline and fence line communities. That's problem 1. Problem 2 is EPA actually has a problem with citizen science, citizen collected data. No data is infallible, whether it be EPA data, industry data. So that's another one of those things in the playbook when you get pushed back on the, communities collecting their own data. So we really need to have more hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks being employed to really get at these issues of air quality in site-specific communities to really inform decision-making. That's a key flaw in our current monitoring framework that's used by the EPA and also those state agencies. Oh, and just want to go back real quick. So one of the speakers mentioned the EPA EJ screen. I think it's a great tool, but I don't think it's good enough. Every state should have its own EJ screen tool, right? One of the best state level tools is called Cal Environmental Screen. Washington has its own mapping tool as well. Houston has a tool called ToxPod, which is for the city of Houston. And in Maryland, we have a tool that I've developed called Maryland EJ Screen, okay? So that tool is a tool, so you should be advocating your state that your state has its own EJ screen tool because you have context that's different. I mean, what's happening in Maryland is gonna be different what's happening in New York, what's happening in Washington, what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Georgia. Okay, just want to say that real quick. Don't have the time to go to the tool, but geospatial tools are really good in combination with air quality monitoring being driven by citizen scientists. So I think what's important, just a note real quick, I want to talk about a couple quick examples. I know we're over time a little bit. We need to get to the Q&A. So in North Carolina, we did work with a community group called the Western Revitalization Association. And we were able to work with that community to look at issues around sewer and water infrastructure. These are post-slavery Black communities that didn't have sewer and water infrastructure. They were on well water and septic tanks. Even though the sewer and water lines from the city ran through their communities, even though they hosted a sewage treatment plant, they weren't connected to the lines. So we worked with community members to collect water samples, to look at levels of E. coli and other fecal indicators, to get them to stop the highway from being built, not just as a grad student, and also get them first-time installation of sewer and water infrastructure. We call these communities pre-New Deal communities. You still got communities like that in the country where roads are not paved, who don't have access to sewer and water. Uniontown, Alabama. Some of you may know about Uniontown from Senator Cory Booker. Uniontown is 20 miles from Selma. Uniontown is a community that has a per capita income about $12,000. See this first picture in the top left-hand corner? Is that a mountain? No. That is 4 million tons of coal ash, okay, put on top of a plantation cemetery. See the picture below. This is also a community that has a cheese plant where they spray cheese waste. They have a catfish factory and catfish plant. And then, unlike you, when you flush your toilet, your waste goes to the sewage treatment plant. When they flush their toilet, that waste goes to the containment pond and they spray human waste on the ground. So what you see this spray in this top right corner is them spraying human waste. So we've been working with that community in the last 2 years to build out a hyper-local air quality monitoring network to measure particular matter because there's no sensors. There's a digital divide. Our sensors not even connected to Wi-Fi because you have that digital divide issue. So that's another community we're working to kind of empower them through science. Let me give you one more example. I'm gonna end here so we can get to questions. Been also working in other communities to build these hyper-local air quality monitoring networks. I do work in Savannah, Georgia with Harambe House, looking at issues around goods movement. So goods, think ships come in, you have goods taken off the ships on the train and diesel trucks, think about diesel particulates, 40 contaminants that cause cancer. Also diesel pollution, short-term exposure can impact your concentration, your focus, right? So that's important to note. So we have that. I've been working in Charleston, South Carolina, again, around the port issues since about 2007. I also work with Dr. Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright's Gulf Coast Health Equity Consortium. That's a consortium where they have historically Black colleges working with local communities. So they're working in Houston, Texas Southern's working with folks in Houston, Atzel neighborhood, Pleasantville. They're working in Lower Ninth Ward with folks from Dillard and Deep South Center. There are folks working from Alabama A&M, working with folks in Africatown. You know about Africatown because that's where the last ship of enslaved Africans, the flotilla, was found. Also working with Biloxi. And they got FAMU, which is HBCU in Florida, working with folks in Pensacola. So that's a model for how we can work together, bringing HBCUs to work in frontline defense on communities. And this last example, Curtis Bay, Baltimore. Baltimore was one of the first cities in this country that had racism-based zoning. Supreme Court threw it out, but it's the reason why Baltimore looks the way it looks when it comes to segregation, where all the hazards are, right? So in Curtis Bay, they host a medical waste incinerator. We talking about COVID-19, you have a lot of medical waste going to that incinerator. They host a solid waste incinerator. They host super polluters. This community is a typical sacrifice zone, right? And so you have issues around economic disparities. Look at the median household income in that community compared to the state of Maryland, compared to the US. Issues around health disparities, right? Morbidity when it comes to heart disease, respiratory diseases, right? And at one point in time, under the toxic release inventory, this was the most toxic zip code in the whole country, okay, based on TRI. You know, some facilities don't report, so based on TRI. And so just want to end here, you know, we need to get youth involved in this work as well, right? So we talk about how one person can be a ripple in a positive way, and we know how one person can be a ripple in a negative way, but I'll keep my comments short on that. So Destiny Watford organized students through a group called Free Your Voice to stop a new incentive for being built in the community. And they were able to do this through citizen science, through community engagement, right? And she won the Goldman Award for North America in 2016. That's basically a Nobel Peace Prize, right? So I just want to end here because we have to get youth involved too in this movement. We need youth, we need young people, we need their energy to make sure we can eradicate environmental racism and environmental slavery. And I'll stop there, thank you.
Okay, so we need to.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. This was very moving and informative and thought-provoking. And I think that there are going to be a lot of questions around it. Barbara, I'm going to let you take over from here.
Okay, all of our speakers have given us a lot of food for thought. So we are going to take Q&A. We're going to allow people to raise their hands to ask questions, and you can unmute yourselves to ask questions. To start with, we had one or two questions in the chat room. Let's see, go back. There were two questions for Dr. Hudda, I believe. There was a question about for people living near JFK Airport, what is the mileage away from JFK that's considered to be a community at risk? That was the first question. And the second question for Dr. Hudda was, has your research on airport emissions factored in air temperature and humidity? And then we'll take our questions from the floor.
So I haven't made measurements at JFK, nor am I aware of anybody who's made measurements downwind of JFK in communities. So I'd be guessing, but it's a reasonable guess based on what I know from extensive work done in Los Angeles and in Boston. JFK is a major airport. So I would, if I was doing an air monitoring campaign, I would aim for somewhere around a radius of around 7 miles or so, if I was setting up monitors. And so the approach we use is mobile monitoring. So we start close to the airport and keep going further and further and further out till we see a detectable impact. My guess would be at least 7 miles.
And I think 7 miles will take us as far as at least the Grand Central Parkway. So to give people a sense of how far out the communities, the EJ community is probably from JFK Airport. And all of those communities that are on the runways, the north, what we call the north-south runways, the planes, as soon as they take off, are very low over the community. So just to give people a sense of what's going on. Okay, so let's go to our questions. Who has the first question? No one has a question?
Yes, this is Dawn.
Okay, Dawn. Hi, Dawn.
And since Dr. Hudda went first, I'm going to ask the question to her first. So I'm wondering what recommendations you have for the aviation industry based on your findings, if you have any at all.
So aviation industry, I know, is working on reducing emissions from airports. I think everybody agrees that that's a unified goal. I can talk to you about the approach that they are taking, which is they are trying to cut down on idling emissions a lot at the airport. So planes do idle and they do emit a lot during that time, which of course gets advected downwind. They have been coming out with new standards on what's called the non-volatile particulate matter emissions, so the black carbon. They are trying to switch over to a newer fleet, which was mostly driven by noise concerns, but those newer engines have better emissions profile. My advice or ask would be not so much from the industry, but I suppose for us to make conscientious choices. We all fly, we all benefit from airports, but we don't all experience the impacts of aviation emissions to the extent that near airport communities do. And a lot of the stuff that's moved at the airports is also cargoes as opposed to just passengers. And I mean, do you really need second-day Amazon delivery on everything? Right? We're all making choices that are contributing towards worst environmental outcomes. Maybe we should, I mean, that would be my ask from everybody, is how can we make better choices in our everyday lives that reduce adverse impacts of emissions on people's exposures and on the climate.
Okay, thank you. A question came up. I know there's severe thunderstorms where we are, and I don't know how many of you are in that kind of environment, but we're just going to kind of keep moving forward and hope that there's no interference with the sound or anything. I don't see anything on here. Okay, so we have a question. Yvette Clark, do you have a question? You want to ask it, or you just want me to raise it from the chat room? Yvette Clark Watkins.
I'm sorry, if you could just raise it from the chat room. It's kind of noisy where I am.
Oh, okay. So the question was, how can we get our teens involved? And that's to Dr. Wilson.
Yeah. Oh, can you hear me? Okay, cool.
Yes.
I'll do real quick. Yeah, I think working with youth is really, really important. So I put in the chat, you see if they can get involved in the Sunrise Movement. Also, the climate strikes. I mean, think about all the youth that are out there protesting. I mean, I've been really just so happy and proud to see them out there. There's student groups, like for example, NAACP has their climate justice program. You know, NAACP has youth chapters, and they're getting young folks engaged on the issues of climate change. You also have the Climate Justice Alliance, the opportunity to engage youth. So, and I think as simple as introducing some of these concepts, particularly through STEM, think about STEM for social justice, right? I mean, part of the reason why I got into STEM is because I can become a scientist to work on these issues, right? And that's why my job is not to do the great science. My job is to change the next generation. So I try to do as much work as possible with K-12, undergrads, and grad students. And so I think finding those programs, Boys and Girls Club, Girl Scouts and Boys Club, Girl Scouts, any clubs where we can bring STEM and environmental issues to them, and they already have those programs, that's a really good place to start.
Okay, and I want to make Ms. Watkins aware that the Eastern Queens Alliance has a program called Roots and Shoots Youth Brigade, which is a leadership council. We formed it this year, and it's taking off. So if there are youth in particularly in Queens who are interested in being in a service learning program, with a good, strong focus on the environment, that would be a good a program. And you can reach out to us. You know, we'll give you our phone number. You can reach out to us and let us know, because that group is really taking off. Okay, so I'm looking for a next question here. And I see Dr. Wilson is answering a lot of people's questions here. So Abdul Salam Musa said, we have been given a lot of scientific data regarding the environment. We know people of color are the most impacted from these statistics. My question is, how do we address the spiritual roots that allow human beings to treat others as they are? And I guess that's to anybody. Okay.
I'll jump in real quick. I'll try to be succinct. I think that's a powerful question. As I said earlier, about recognizing our humanity, human unity, right? I think it starts there. We have to see each other as we will see our kids. And we have to reconnect the spirit of togetherness. I mean, we need to bring people together in the social movement. And I think interfaith engagement is really important. My work in Charleston is working with Black Muslims, right? First time I've ever done that, right? But trying to work with groups who are grounded in different faiths. And I think about interfaith power and light. They're doing work on environmental issues. The Catholic Church with the Pope's Laudato Si, you know, the cycle on climate change. The Catholic Church is trying to do more work and looking at how climate change impacts the poor. And then also you have this whole Green the Church movement out there. So connected to the Green the Church movement, Catholic Church's work, the interfaith power and light, I think is a really good place to start. And I think by doing that, we can bring people together more. But you're exactly right. That's where we have to start.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so our next question is from Tristan Codrington. Dr. Wilson, many of the communities you mentioned that were activated to organize face the large, immediate, and obvious threats. How do we activate residents, especially young people, in environmental justice communities that are facing more subtle and invisible threats like air pollution? It's an excellent question.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So one of the previous speakers talked about highways and pollution from mobile sources. We call it traffic-related air pollution. So just like a little bit of quick history, you know, when you think about, I talked about segregation a little bit earlier and racism. Think about the National Highway Defense Act and how many of those highways were built through Black and brown communities during the time of what we call urban renewal, right? So that's why you have so many communities with highways going through them where they've been impacted by combustion byproducts. So I think part of what we need to do is we have to have better hyperlocal monitoring of those pollution sources, right? So you can see near real-time levels of particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, other criteria, air pollutants. And that is a way to increase people's critical environmental literacy. You got to empower folks through knowledge and information. So I think in that way, if we are able to build out these networks, people can be empowered. I think also we got to do things to mitigate those impacts, whether it be more phytoremediation or more physical barriers. And then guess what? We need to transform our communities. We should move away from highways and byways to our communities, concrete and asphalt, and bring in more greenways and foodways. Think about the food, energy, water nexus, right? You know, people have to choose between food, paying an electricity bill, paying for food, paying for the medicines. If we brought in more urban forestry, trees can help mitigate air pollution. Research has shown that. If we bring in more urban agriculture, food sovereignty, people grow their own food, folks. If you reduce the amount of cars in our cities, make them car free, that's what COVID has shown us. As one speaker said, air pollution levels have gone down. Why can't we preserve that? Why can't we make car free, increase mass transit, electrify mass transit so you have no emissions? So you have to have a combination of electrification, remove all these highways from our communities, bring in more green infrastructure, bring in more urban agriculture. We really seriously need to rethink how we construct cities and make them smarter, make them greener, and make them more equitable. And that's going to make them healthier. And that's going to knock out air pollution, but also provide other opportunities when it comes to food, housing, access to basic amenities, y'all. So that I'll stop there because I can go on and on, but thank you for that question.
So that was an excellent, that's an excellent suggestion. What we have found in particularly in Southeast Queens is that wherever there are green spaces, there is the tendency that the city is removing those green spaces for economic development. And a lot of this is going on right by JFK Airport, for instance. So while we have been struggling to maintain our green spaces, we find that there's a tug of war there, that the city is taking up green spaces when we're advocating for them, that the city is saying you have to cut down trees near the airport because it's under the flight paths. And so there's a real tug of war in areas where we're even told are in the flood zone, the 100-year flood zone. They're constantly taking up pervious surfaces to put impervious surfaces in. Mm-hmm. So that's a real push and pull between the government, the powers that be, and the people. And so how do we deal with that?
I think some of the speakers have talked about this. If we're gonna combat climate change, right? Think about a lot of our communities are urban heat islands. Why is that? Too many impervious surfaces, not enough tree canopy, and we don't have ACs. So you bring in more green. You don't get rid of green infrastructure. You got to increase the green infrastructure, right? And you see that. Let me say this about climate change. We're doing like doom and gloom. EJ community's been dealing with doom and gloom for too long. You know, just trying to survive, right? We have assets. But how do we build healthy communities, right? So don't do doom and gloom around climate change and your climate action plans. Let's think about the opportunities. Let's do workforce development. Bring in green infrastructure. Bring in renewables. So there's a way for folks to do economic development, but that is unhealthy economic development. There's other forms of development where we can produce more jobs that have less impact on the environment and they're better for people's health.
Right, exactly. We have another question here. From Phoebe Gittleson. She said the presentation was incredible. I haven't heard the term environmental slavery before. Do you find that it's a stronger, more impactful word than environmental racism or environmental justice?
Oh yeah. So I can share with the organizers the paper I wrote about environmental slavery. The reason why we came up with the term, it's not like I came up by myself, it's what community partners, it's like what they were dealing with. Like they were being used, right, to host these lanes. You heard from one of the speakers who talked about, you know, impacts on developing babies, right? It's like your ecosystem being used as a sink for the pollution. And then also your body is literally being used as a sink for pollution. You are commodified, decommodified, and dehumanized all at the same time in the name of our economic system of capitalism. So it talks about environmental exploitation and also economic exploitation, and you getting none of the benefits from your, you know, internalizing these social, environmental, and economic externalities, right? So that's why it's environmental slavery, it's environmental servitude. So and it also brings in racism, both historic and contemporary racism, and how that's baked into many of our housing, economic, educational, policing policies.
So I don't see any other questions here in the chat. Are there any other questions out there? Okay, I do see a question from Sandra Long. What are the most effective kinds of protective face masks to minimize exposure to the environment, including COVID-19? And anybody can answer that.
Hi, Sandra. I can speak to that a little bit. So N95 masks work great. If you can find one, if you can access one, there's something called KN95 mask, which are not exactly N95, but they are pretty close to that, and they work really well. You have to, so the thing with the mask is you have to have a really tight fitting. The fitting is everything with masks. You can have a great mask, but not a great fitting with your face, and then it won't work as well. So you want a mask that fits really well, covers your face really well. And if you want, you can double layer some cloth masks, and they are also, they work very well. People oftentimes complain about like not being able to breathe very well through the mask. And that is when you know it's working, if it's making you struggle a little bit. So it's, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, but I would recommend, if I use KN95 masks, maybe you can try ordering them online, or they should be popular in stores. They were very difficult to purchase and find, so I do keep on reusing mine. And though it's not really recommended that you keep on reusing your mask if it gets dirty and you have your own germs accumulate in it. But oh, someone asked, how about PM 2.5 filter inserts? Sure, you could try that. That should help. But the viruses, if you're concerned particularly about COVID-19 virus, then the size range of the bioaerosol is much smaller than PM 2.5. These are much smaller particulate particles, or technically they're aerosols, bioaerosol. But something is better than nothing.
Yeah. There's a question here about the HEPA filter mask. I've started seeing those online.
HEPA would technically get into the size range that you're considering, but again, it'll make breathing through HEPA a little difficult. But if you have really good fitting, and you're only breathing through those little pockets of like HEPA filtration, and that's where the air is coming in and getting filtered, sure, it can work. And there was another question on by someone, Harold, I believe, about where to place filters in homes. So if you only have one air filter, well, if you can invest in whole home air filtration, great. If you can buy multiple air filters for your place, great. But if you only have one air filter, then I would recommend putting it in your bedroom or the room that you spend most of your day in. But it's usually the bedroom, because people sleep for long stretches of time in the bedroom. And turn it on a few hours before going to bed and close the bedroom door, so the filter actually has time to clean up the air before you go to bed. And then keep it running all night. So it makes white noise that most people actually kind of like, as opposed to dislike. So it's noise is usually the complaint. And the second complaint with filters is draft. Some people don't like drafts. So you'll have to experiment a little bit to find the right situation in your bedroom where you can run the filter, but the drafts don't bother you. Air coming out, blowing out of the filter doesn't bother you, and the noise doesn't bother you. But the common complaint, not the common complaint, but the common challenge with any of these filter intervention trials, whether it be for, asthma risk reduction in children, to any other setting, is that people buy filters and they'll run it initially, but they then stop running the filters. So just buying is not enough. It has to be part of your daily practice to use it, and also replace the filter and maintain it. So I think usually it's 6 months is a good time to replace the filters on the portable HEPA filters that we get. And just keep it running. It helps.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have one question that I see here, and then we know that we're almost up against the 9 o'clock range, and but we did have a last segment from Beth Gardiner, which dealt with the regulations and her recommendations, her comments, her thoughts about where we go from here. So I will play that right after I ask this question. And if you have to leave, we understand that. So Latoya Benjamin asked, how can we advance the drastic need to, what can we do to help further advance the drastic need to address our environmental issues here in Southeast Queens? And she also wants to know where she can read the paper on environmental slavery. And so I guess that might go to Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, I can get the paper to the organizers. So I'll send it in a few minutes.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah. And the question, I think that's more for the community partners, right? For y'all to answer.
Yeah. And it's definitely something that we all need to sit down and discuss. And I know, Dr. Wilson, in midway through your presentation, you had there was a chart up there. It looked like it was about 5 different steps to community engagement.
You would share that? I can share that too.
Yeah, because the Eastern Queens Alliance, we've been involved in working with the public agenda. And we have been talking about cycles of resilience and how to maximize community engagement. And that, when I saw that chart, it looked like what we've been talking about. So I thought that was excellent. We asked Beth Gardiner about current regulations and what's going on with the EPA and the Clean Air Act and all those kinds of things. And also we talked to her about the whole concern about the economy and what the purpose of economy is, the economy is, and so forth. And she had some very interesting remarks. So this is the rest of Beth Gardiner's presentation.
Politicians in those industries put the blame on communities, on people who are breathing the air that is present and is surrounding them in their community. They would rather put the blame there than put it on,
Okay. And its economic aftermath could offer the chance to change course. The best, most hopeful response is centered on what the whole purpose of an economy is.
Yes.
Human well-being, collective well-being, rather than maximizing profits for a small number of people and corporations. And so some of the points you just raised, the Trump administration favoring the needs of corporations to survive versus the needs of human beings to survive and to thrive, really speak to some of that. Can, in fact, a human society succeed and excel economically at the same time that it takes care of the human well-being? What are your thoughts on that? And can you talk a little bit more about what your thoughts are on what the Trump administration is doing right now to compromise that?
Sure. So, I mean, this is something that we hear so often and that I come across so often as an environmental journalist, oh, we can't afford it. We can't, there's jobs on one side and there's sort of environmental, purity or what have you on the other side, polar bears versus, a paycheck. And that is really the wrong framework, actually. First of all, environment is not about polar bears. I mean, sure, I do care about the polar bears and the ice caps, but to me, this issue of air pollution, it's not a, environment issue for some kind of niche, green person. This is a health issue, actually. Air pollution is a health issue. So what you're asking when you ask, can we afford it, is can we afford to create conditions, to create air that is going to allow people to lead healthy lives? And just referencing back again to what I told you before, that the science is very clear that when you have increased levels of air pollution, you are going to have increased levels of heart attacks, strokes, cancer, dementia, on and on, right up to the biggest health impact of all, premature death, more deaths when you have more air pollution. And actually, to me, one thing that made the issue of air pollution so interesting to report on is that it just absolutely intersects with every one of the major issues our society and in fact our world is grappling with. It intersects with, like we talked about, the legacy of racism, systemic racism, and the brutal economic inequality we have in our country. And it intersects very much with this issue of the trade-off between sort of private profit, corporate profit, versus the public good. And one thing that I found astonishing in learning about air pollution is that because those health effects are so great, this is not actually a trade-off. This is I don't know what the expression is. It's a win-win or something. Every study that has been done, when you look back, the EPA actually is required to do these studies of what the impact has been of the Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1970. It was updated and tightened in 1990. And, you know, the United States, American air quality has improved dramatically in that time, although we obviously still have a significant challenge, particularly in heavily impacted communities. The first 20 years from 1970 to 1990, the EPA's own estimate was that the benefits, the dollar benefits of all this improved health were 40 or more times greater than the cost. Dozens of times. And that trend continued from 1970 to 1990 and coming forward to today. So it's not actually a trade-off. It is a benefit. When you require corporations and polluters to reduce their emissions so that the air gets cleaner, the economy as a whole, even if you put aside any questions of, you know, human well-being and what that's worth, the economy as a whole benefits in dollar terms dozens of times over. However, where I think there is a trade-off is that the people doing the paying the costs, and the people doing the benefiting are not the same people. So when the EPA makes a regulation and says, you know, pollution needs to come down by this level, you can't put out this amount of mercury or particulate matter or what have you, companies have to spend money to comply with that regulation, whether it be a power plant or a car manufacturer that their cars are regulated, or any other, you know, big industry. These, again, are the very, very wealthy, enormous multinational corporate concerns. They have to spend money, and they know exactly what it's going to cost them. I have this many power plants. It costs this much per smokestack to put the right scrubber in or whatever. They know exactly what it's going to cost. But who reaps the benefits? We all do. 330 million people. And most of us, we talked about this idea of the impact of air pollution being invisible. You know, all these people are having heart attacks because of air pollution, but they don't know it, right? If I have a heart attack tomorrow, I will never say, no doctor will say, this was because of air pollution, yet we know as a whole that there's more of them. But the flip side of that is that when you don't have the heart attack, are you going to wake up tomorrow and say, oh, great, I didn't have a heart attack, you know, my spouse or whatever didn't, you know, have a stroke. So I'm so happy that we have the Clean Air Act. You know, we don't know it. 330 million people, the benefit is diffuse, it's spread among all these people who don't know that they've reaped it. And obviously the corporations who have to spend the money are, you know, screaming and yelling, and they're very powerful. So that, to me, is one of the biggest political challenges around air pollution and cleaning up the air. Same goes for climate change, by the way, which is also disproportionately impacting on a lot of frontline communities. So, you know, what is an economy for? That's the question you're asking, right? Is an economy for, you know, GM and Volkswagen and Exxon and Chevron to shovel money into their pockets and, you know, give it out to a very small number of shareholders? Or is an economy for all of us to wake up every day and, you know, not have this invisible thing, this bodily function that we all need? It's the most basic, you know, activity of life, right? Breathing, for that not to cause us actual harm. What is an economy for? So we, I think, know how the Trump administration would answer that question, because they're answering it every day with their actions. You know, I think one of the most consistent, you know, forces in this administration that is so erratic and all over the map on so many things, one of the most consistent pushes from the Trump administration from day one has been deregulation. And that, again, it's about money and it's about power, because these regulations benefit you and me, but they cost money to these big corporations that, you know, oftentimes are donating money and all that. So it's a transfer of dollars, just the way, you know, you could write a check to a company, you could give them a tax break, or you could roll back a regulation, and that benefits a company that no longer has to spend money on it. So what we have seen since COVID hit is that this very, very aggressive deregulatory push that has been going on, and it's often like very technical changes that, you know, even a journalist or let alone an average person, you know, is not going to be tuning into necessarily, but that have tremendous consequences for health and for the profit of these companies. That was already very aggressive. It has accelerated on steroids since COVID began because, you know, we're all pretty preoccupied paying attention to this other huge thing. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but.
Yeah, I think that these are all compelling points, and something that I have observed that I don't know that you can respond to, but what's especially challenging is that you don't necessarily see or feel or know that you're breathing in the dirty air.
Yes.
And you don't necessarily believe when people are telling you this. On the other hand, corporations offer certain what people consider to be benefits that and create some appetites for things that people think they must have. They must have that package tomorrow. They simply must. They must be able to take the red eye over to the West Coast. They must. And all the things that they believe they must be able to do that corporations make possible, have that job, for example.
Yes.
And so the resistance is not just from the government, but sometimes it's from the very people who are being harmed. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and in fact, in some communities, you know, you'll see that actually the people who live in the community are the ones who have the jobs. You know, this is very true, like down south in a lot of the oil and petrochemical regions in like Texas and Louisiana. You know, you're the one living next to the factory, so you have a, you know, maybe good paying job, but you're also living with the toxic consequences of that. And I think that's true. And, you know, like you said, these benefits, so-called, are very tangible, right? You mentioned delivery package, overnight package and all that. You know, freight is actually one of the dirtiest and most polluting industries there is, not just the flights that you live with, but sea shipping and trucking, which I know impacts your community as well, and so many other communities across the country. So, but you know, you don't see that when you just click on Amazon to get your thing, whatever, your birthday present, you know, for somebody delivered tomorrow, right? And, you know, like we've been talking about, I think one of the greatest political challenges around air pollution is the fact that it is invisible. You know, and you hear that word a lot when you start learning about this issue. Invisibility, and it doesn't just mean that you literally oftentimes can't see the pollution. Sometimes you can. Certain types of smog are more visible to the eye, but, you know, particularly actually the most dangerous, one of the most dangerous forms of air pollution is called PM 2.5. They're tiny, tiny particles, come from burning all different kinds of fossil fuels and other things, even like wood, creates PM 2.5 in the air. You really can't see it actually. And, you know, you'd have to have terrible levels of PM 2.5 for it to actually be visible. But at much lower levels, it's the reason these particles are so dangerous is that they're small enough to penetrate into your lung and then cross the barrier into your bloodstream. And once they're in your bloodstream, particles have been found in brain tissue, in heart tissue, in, you know, umbilical cords and fetal tissue. So they're really traveling everywhere in our bodies. But I met this one activist out in LA, and he said to me, I just really hit home, you know, if you see someone in front of you get hit by a car, you will never forget that for the rest of your life, that image. But actually every day, thousands of people are dying from the effects of air pollution, but we don't even see it. We don't notice it. You know, as I said, sort of in terms of the scientific evidence, is very clearly established. It's not in any way really a matter of debate, although one thing that the Trump administration has tried to do is really attack the science on air pollution the same way that they have done on climate change, and that Republicans have been doing for a long time on climate change. they're now challenging the science on air pollution because it's used to justify these regulations, which cost money to corporations, parenthetically. You know, it's very visible in the data, but you know, most of us are not statisticians and epidemiologists. We don't see it in our everyday lives. So, you know, I guess that for me was also about why I wanted to write about this issue. You know, I hate this word because it's so overused in the journalistic world, but a storyteller, right? Mm-hmm. You know, I think we relate better, and it's sort of a cliche, to stories of individual people that we can kind of connect to and read about and, you know, empathize with, rather than statistics like 7 million a year, 100,000 a year dying from air pollution. So, you know, that's how I do it, right, is to try to find some of the stories. There's other ways of doing it as well. You know, I've seen photographic work that tries to sort of illustrate some of the impacts of pollution, or, you know, other forms of kind of trying to shine a light. But I think that's really one of the challenges, because like you say, we see the kind of the things we get from this fossil fuel, high pollution economy that we live in, but we don't see so easily all of its impacts. But it doesn't mean they're not real.
That's right.
Yeah.
Somehow or the other, we've been able to survive without some of them during this COVID pandemic, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Right. So it can be done. Well, thank you so much.
So Beth tells us that her way of fighting the air pollution is through stories. And the question came up before, well, what can we do in Southeast Queens, and can anyone do? I think the first thing that we've gotten, that I've picked up from everybody's presentations, is that as individuals, as communities, and even as those people who represent us in the halls of the legislative halls and so forth, we have to really know what the problems are and recognize that the air pollution is really a serious problem, and some of the other kinds of toxicants that Dr. Trasande talked about. Also, we have to recognize what the problems are before we can then start to attack them. And it's only going to be when everybody really works together. That's individuals, full communities, with all of the people who represent them. That was pointed out at our last forum, that it's important to have that social political unit, a full social political unit working together against those things that are plaguing our communities. And that's the only way we are going to really make strides. And that's what I've heard from Dr. Sacoby and very much from his presentation, that it's all levels. And so I really want to thank all of our presenters, Dr. Neelakshi Hudda, Dr. Leo Trasande, Dr. Kimberly Terrell, and Dr. Sacoby Wilson, for their presentations, and for coming and sharing with us, and helping us to understand the links between COVID and pollution and environmental justice, and helping us to see what the total, at least to start moving towards understanding that total picture, and how we can, because then that highlights where the direction in which we need to move. So thank you very much for coming and sharing with us, and we certainly will be reaching back out to you as we struggle with our environmental justice issues, and as others struggle with them across the country. And thank you to all of you who stayed the course and stayed through. We know that it was a long session, but I think it was well worthwhile. And thank you to Gloria Boyce Charles, who not only was one of the co-hosts here, but Gloria did the heavy lifting in terms of pulling all of this together. So thank you to Gloria. And thank you to the person who's sitting behind the scenes who let you into the room and tried to make sure that you, I can't say made you comfortable because he had nothing to do with that, but Richard Belgrave, who is a member of the Alliance, who's also an environmental scientist. So I want to thank all of the people who came out and who helped us to understand the topic, give us a better understanding of the topic. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Barbara.
And good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah. And if we didn't answer some questions, we will go back. I think we got most of them. And Gloria said, and thank you to Beth Gardiner. I think I forgot her in the list, but we had thanked her personally when we interviewed her.